It was a chilly morning at Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport, and the buzz of passengers filled the terminal. Flight 247 to Newark was packed, the cabin alive with the usual pre-flight chaos. Among the travelers settling into their seats was a young man in first class, his presence impossible to ignore. Barron Trump, now a teenager towering over 6 feet, sat quietly by the window, absorbed in a hardcover book. Though his face was recognizable, his demeanor suggested he preferred to go unnoticed. Further back in the plane, an elderly man in his late 70s slowly made his way to the economy section. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his aged leather duffel bag hung from one shoulder. The patches and medals on his worn military jacket spoke volumes about a life of service and sacrifice. As he moved through the narrow aisle, passengers exchanged glances, their whispers speculating about the veteran's history. Taking his assigned seat near the back, he found himself wedged between a talkative businessman and a restless toddler. Meanwhile, flight attendants worked briskly to ensure everyone was settled for takeoff. The hum of conversation filled the cabin until a sudden commotion broke the rhythm. The elderly veteran, clearly uncomfortable in his assigned spot, apologized as he asked for a different seat. His soft-spoken request drew attention, including that of Barron Trump, who looked up from his book. Leaning slightly into the aisle, Barron watched the situation unfold, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. Without hesitation, Barron pressed the call button, signaling for a flight attendant. When she arrived, he spoke softly but firmly. "Excuse me, can I switch seats with the gentleman in the military jacket?" The request caught the attendant off guard, her surprise evident as she blinked at him. Passengers in first class turned their heads, their curiosity piqued. It wasn't every day that someone gave up such a coveted seat, let alone a teenager with a recognizable name. The flight attendant nodded, her tone professional but tinged with admiration. "Let me check," she replied before making her way to the back of the plane. As Barron stood to retrieve his carry-on bag, the murmurs in first class grew louder. A woman seated across the aisle leaned toward him, confusion evident in her voice. "You don't have to do that, you know. You paid for this seat." Barron smiled faintly, his response simple yet profound. "Some people deserve it more." Moments later, the flight attendant returned, her expression a mix of curiosity and respect. "He said he'd be happy to switch," she informed Barron, her voice steady but warm. With a polite nod, Barron made his way down the aisle, leaving behind the plush comforts of first class. As Barron approached the back of the plane, whispers followed him. Passengers exchanged wide-eyed glances, a few even discreetly snapping photos on their phones. Despite the attention, Barron seemed unbothered, his focus solely on the elderly veteran now seated in the crowded economy section. The veteran looked up as Barron approached, confusion flickering across his weathered face. "Are you sure, young man?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with surprise. "You don't have to do this for me." "I want to," Barron replied, extending a hand. "Thank you for your service. Please take my seat." For a moment, the veteran hesitated, clearly moved by the gesture. Then, with a firm handshake, he accepted. "Well, thank you," he said, his voice tinged with emotion. "That's mighty kind of you." As the veteran made his way to first class, the murmurs in the cabin grew louder. A young mother whispered to her daughter, "Did you see that? He just gave up his seat." The businessman seated beside Barron in economy shook his head in disbelief, muttering, "Never seen anything like that on a flight." Barron slid into the now vacant economy seat, folding his long legs into the cramped space. He reopened his book, seemingly indifferent to the stares around him. In first class, the veteran settled into the luxurious seat. Visibly overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness, the veteran adjusted his armrest, his hands trembling slightly as he settled into the plush seat. A flight attendant approached him with a warm smile, offering a complimentary drink and blanket. "The young man said you should have this seat," she explained softly. The veteran smiled faintly, his voice barely audible as he replied, "It's been years since I've been treated like this." He glanced back toward the economy section, where Barron now sat calmly, completely absorbed in his book. What seemed like a small gesture to some was monumental to the veteran, a moment that carried a deep, unspoken weight. The cabin exhaled collectively as the earlier tension eased. Passengers settled in as the plane taxied onto the runway. However, as the engines roared to life and the aircraft ascended into the sky, it became clear that this story was far from over. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the soft hum of the engines filled the cabin. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, serving drinks and snacks. Yet the atmosphere aboard felt far from routine. Passengers kept stealing glances at Barron in economy and the veteran seated in first class. The whispers of admiration and curiosity grew, but the real story was only just beginning. The veteran sat quietly at first, sipping water as he stared out the window. His hands rested on his lap, the faintest tremor visible. Then, as if compelled by a sudden wave of emotion, he turned to the passenger seated next to him, a middle-aged woman with kind, inquisitive eyes. "I need to say something," the veteran began, his voice just loud enough to be heard. The woman turned toward him, her curiosity evident. Adjusting the small pin on his lapel, a purple heart, the veteran sighed deeply before continuing. "That young man who gave me this seat, his family saved my life once." The woman blinked, startled. "What do you mean?" she asked gently. The veteran leaned back, his voice growing steadier as he recounted his tale. "It was decades ago, during the Vietnam War. I was stationed overseas, far from home, with no family to support me. I'd been badly injured, shot twice in the leg, and when I finally returned stateside, I felt lost. I had no direction, no purpose, nothing." His voice wavered momentarily before he pushed on. "I ended up in New York, trying to piece my life back together. I didn't have a place to stay or enough money to eat. One day, I ran into a man outside a diner. He didn't just hand me $1 and move on. He sat with me and listened to my story. That man was Donald Trump's father, Fred." The woman's eyes widened in surprise, and nearby passengers who had been eavesdropping leaned in closer. "Fred Trump?" she asked, her voice laced with disbelief. The veteran nodded, his expression growing wistful. "Yes. He didn't owe me a thing, but he made sure I had a roof over my head and a job to get back on my feet. He never asked for anything in return. He just told me, 'You serve this country. It's the least we can do.' I'll never forget those words." By now, the conversation had caught the attention of several passengers in first class. The veteran's voice gained strength as he continued, his eyes glistening with gratitude. "I always wanted to thank his family, but I never got the chance. Life moved on, and I thought that moment was lost forever. And now today, that man's grandson has given me a gift I'll never forget." What are the odds of something like this happening? In the economy section, Barron remained oblivious to the growing buzz around him. He continued reading his book, his long legs awkwardly tucked into the tight space. Meanwhile, in first class, the veteran's story began to ripple through the cabin. Passengers exchanged glances, their murmurs of amazement spreading like wildfire. A flight attendant, visibly moved by the story, leaned toward the veteran. "Would you like me to tell him what you just shared?" she asked softly. The veteran hesitated, then shook his head. "No, not yet. Let the boy have his piece. He doesn't need to know how much this means to me. Not right now." Despite his request, the passengers couldn't contain their astonishment. What had started as a simple act of kindness now felt almost predestined, as though the universe had aligned for this moment to happen. As the flight progressed, the story continued to spread among the passengers. People shared their own heartfelt reflections, creating an atmosphere unlike any the flight crew had witnessed before. A young mother cradling her sleeping toddler chimed in softly. "My dad always told me that even the smallest act of kindness can ripple far beyond what we imagine." What Barron did today proves that. The veteran listened quietly, his eyes softening as he absorbed the words of those around him. "It's true," he said after a moment. "Sometimes just being seen, being acknowledged, can change everything. That's what Fred Trump did for me, and now his grandson has done it again." The plane hit a patch of turbulence, causing a slight jolt, but the atmosphere in the cabin remained steady. The conversations carried a shared sense of catharsis, as though everyone on board was united by an invisible thread of kindness and gratitude. Just as the flight began its descent into Newark, the unexpected occurred. In the economy section, Barron remained engrossed in his book, unaware of the emotional storm brewing throughout the plane. Meanwhile, in first class, the veteran sat quietly, his hands folded as he gazed out of the window, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. Passengers around him exchanged knowing glances, their admiration for both men palpable. As the captain announced the final approach, a flight attendant who had been following the unfolding story made her way to Barron. Kneeling slightly to meet him at eye level, she spoke softly. "I wanted to let you know that the gentleman you gave your seat to shared something extraordinary about your family. Would you like to hear it?" Barron looked up from his book, his curiosity piqued. Closing the cover slowly, he nodded. "Sure," he said simply, his tone calm yet intrigued. The attendant hesitated briefly, searching for the right words. "Years ago, your grandfather, Fred Trump, helped him when he was at his lowest point," she explained. "He said your grandfather gave him a place to stay and a job, expecting nothing in return. Today, he said your kindness reminded him of that moment." For a moment, Barron sat in thoughtful silence. His expression remained composed, but his eyes softened, reflecting the weight of the revelation. "That's something, isn't it?" he finally said, his voice quiet yet steady. The flight attendant smiled warmly. "It really is," she replied. "I thought you should know." As the plane touched down and passengers began preparing to disembark, the veteran surprised everyone by walking toward the economy section. His eyes scanned the rows until they landed on Barron, who was standing to retrieve his bag. The young man looked up, clearly surprised by the gesture. Extending a hand, the veteran said, "Young man, I wanted to thank you face to face. What you did today brought me full circle. Your family has a history of kindness, and you've carried that forward. Don't ever forget how much these moments matter." Barron shook the veteran's hand firmly, his voice steady but humble. "I didn't do anything special, sir," he said. "You deserved it." The cabin fell silent as passengers watched the exchange unfold. Some had tears in their eyes, while others wore soft, reflective smiles. The connection between the two men, generations apart, felt profound, a living testament to the enduring power of gratitude and empathy. As the passengers disembarked, many paused to thank Barron for his gesture, while others approached the veteran to offer handshakes and words of gratitude for his service. The mood was unlike anything anyone had experienced on a flight before, a collective moment of humanity that left a lasting impression on everyone involved. At the gate, the veteran turned back one last time, tipping his hat toward Barron. "You've got a good heart, son. Don't ever lose that," he said warmly. Barron nodded, his usually reserved demeanor softening enough to show the impact of the veteran's words. As he walked toward baggage claim, he pulled out his phone and typed a brief message. Hesitating for a moment, he hit send. The text read, "Grandpa would have been proud of today. This story is a powerful reminder that even the smallest act of kindness can create ripples far beyond the moment. Whether it's giving up a seat, offering a listening ear, or simply acknowledging someone's struggle, such gestures have the power to connect people in ways we never anticipate." If this story moved you, don't forget to share it and keep the conversation alive. Let's remind the world that kindness still matters. And if you'd like more stories like this, subscribe to join us for another unforgettable journey.